There's a place, He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Revelation. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. All right, so now we're going to leave the Ephesians, we're going to leave Ephesus, and we're going to go travel 35 miles north in the country of modern Turkey. And now you get to this other seaport city called Smyrna. And Smyrna means bitter, but it's also the Greek word for myrrh. And so when you read your Christmas story and you see those three wise men and they come to bring their gifts to baby Jesus, they brought him gold, frankincense, and Smyrna, because that's what Smyrna means. And then when Nicodemus, he brought that 100 pounds of spices to prepare Jesus' body for burial, he brought a mixture of aloes and Smyrna, because Smyrna means myrrh. And to release the fragrance of myrrh, it had to be crushed. And that's what was happening to these people. These people were being crushed by the persecution. Now, Smyrna, it was also a very rich city. It was very wealthy. In that way, it was just like Ephesus. Because Ephesus, it was a seaport city, and Smyrna, it was a seaport city, and all that trade that came from the whole valley flowed through its harbor, and it had its specialty in the trading of wines. But very early in Smyrna's history, it had identified itself with Rome. And that was long before Rome had ever become a world power. And Smyrna was rewarded greatly for its loyalty to Rome. And it wasn't only that Rome loved Smyrna, but Smyrna loved Rome. And in 195 BC, they built this temple for emperor worship. And that was their main deity among all the other deities in Smyrna. And at the time of this letter that is written by Jesus, given through John, Smyrna has a population of about 100,000 people. But there was one time in its history where the city had been totally destroyed. But that city was rebuilt by Alexander the Great after he conquered the whole world. And so this city was a beautiful city, and it was laid out beautifully. So they had all these wide streets, and they all ran north to south and east to west. But this city was full of idolatry. But they had this one street, it's called the Golden Street, this long street. And on one side of that street, they had the temple for emperor worship. And on the other end of that street, they had a temple to Zeus. And between those two temples, they had just about any other pagan deity you wanted to worship. So this is kind of like the Las Vegas Strip in paganism. And in the early days of the Caesars, they didn't consider themselves to be gods. They knew that they were just men. But one day, they started practicing worshiping these dead emperors. And from there, it wasn't much of a leap for them to start worshiping the live emperors. And there were a few temples built around various cities to the different emperors. So like Pergamos, what we'll study, they had a temple to Augustus. And Smyrna, they had a temple to Tiberius. And all this emperor worship, it was voluntary. So when you just went to go choose your deity and you chose emperor worship, it was kind of like saying you were going to be patriotic. You're going to be patriotic to Rome. But now with the Emperor Domitian, that worship wasn't voluntary anymore. It became mandatory. But most of the Roman Empire, they overlooked this law. But Smyrna, being so in love with Rome and so in love with their emperor, they enforced it. But with emperor worship, their worship wasn't exclusive. They weren't saying that you could only worship the Caesar and that you couldn't worship any of the other gods. You could worship any of the gods you wanted, but you had to worship the emperor first. And so what you'd have to do is you'd have to go to the emperor's temple, which was on the end of Golden Street, and then you just take a pinch of incense, and then you burn it on the altar with the statue of the emperor's head on it. And then they would write you a certificate that showed that you did your service for the year. And then you could go and you could worship
any deity you wanted. You just had to worship the emperor first. But the Christians, they couldn't do that because they couldn't say Caesar is Lord. And so when Jesus writes his letter to the pastor of this church in Smyrna, he uses the description of himself in chapter 1 where he writes, "These things says the first and the last who was dead and came to life." Because this is how they needed to see Jesus. They needed to see Jesus this way. Because these guys, they're going through intense persecution and they're being killed. And so their hope is in a resurrection. And just like Jesus says to all those other churches, he says, "I know your works." And then Jesus tells them that he knows their tribulations and their poverty. Now, there are different words for poverty in Greek. One just means you're poor and you don't have any extra, but you're making it. You're just poor. But the word that's used here means absolutely destitute, that you have absolutely nothing. And the reason they had absolutely nothing, even though they're living in one of the richest cities in the world, it was because they were Christians, because they wouldn't worship the Caesar. And so these people, they lost their jobs. They couldn't join the guilds. But Jesus, he tells them that they're rich because heaven sees riches in a different way than the world does. And then Jesus, he says, he knows about the blasphemy from the Jews that are not. And then he tells them that they're a synagogue of Satan. And so after the fall in Jerusalem in 70 AD, Smyrna, it had a very large Jewish population. And you kind of would have to wonder, you'd say, well, aren't they being persecuted too? Are these Jews actually offering that incense to the emperor? But the answer is that they didn't have to, because the Jews, they were exempt from this type of worship because Judaism was a recognized legal religion in Rome. And so one would think that they would have had some kind of compassion on the Christians, but they didn't. They didn't show them any mercy. In fact, there were religious Jews that were going out of their way to persecute the Christians, just like the Apostle Paul did before he got saved. But what Jesus is saying here is he's saying, well, they may ethnically be Jews, but spiritually, they're not Jews. They're of the devil. And it's a lot like what he said about the Pharisees, that they were of the devil. And then he says here, do not fear. And that would be better translated of saying, stop being afraid. And then Jesus, he doesn't promise to keep them from the persecution, but he tells them exactly the opposite. He says that they will suffer and that some of them are going to be thrown in prison and they're going to be tested and that this is going to be hard. And you have to realize that these people, they could have escaped all this. All they would have had to do is just take a little pinch of incense and burn it on an altar, and then they wouldn't have to go through all this persecution. And you could almost justify it. But Jesus, he doesn't give them that option. And he tells them to be faithful unto death. And so what he's telling them there is like some of you guys are going to die. But then Jesus also tells them that this persecution is not going to go on forever, that it's going to be short, that it's only going to last for 10 days. And some people think that 10 days represents 10 years. And some people think that this persecution means that it'll last under 10 emperors. But some people think it's just an expression of speech, meaning that it's just going to be a short time. And if you notice here, Jesus, he doesn't have a correction for this church at all, because this church, they didn't compromise. They did everything right. And if you went to modern Turkey today and you went to all these churches and you looked them all up, all the other churches, they would just be these excavated ruins. But this church is still there today, but the city's not called Smyrna anymore. It's called Izmir. And so for their faithfulness, Jesus promises them the crown of life. And so you might think, wow, they're going to get a golden crown. But you'd be wrong, because the word for crown here is Stephano, which is those laurel leaf crowns giving as a trophy to like winning athletes. Or this would be the kind of crown that you'd wear if you were a bride and a groom that you'd wear at your wedding. But this crown that they're giving, like those other crowns, it's not going to turn brown and die, because this is an everlasting crown. And then Jesus tells us again, us with ears, that we need to hear what the Spirit is saying to us, not just to them, but to all the churches, that we all need to hear this. And so it's just like he began telling them how he was dead and now alive. And now he's telling them that they're not going to be hurt by this second death either. All right. So now we're leaving Smyrna, and now we're going to go 50 more miles north, but we're not going to be on the coast anymore. We're going to go up this hill that's overlooking a valley, and now you're going to find yourself in Pergamos. And the word Pergamos is the Greek word for citadel. But that's actually where we get our word for parchment, because these guys are the ones who developed leather parchment, like paper. And so this too, it was a very wealthy city, but it's not because they had a seaport. This was a city of higher learning. They were a university city. So this is a college town. This is like Ann Arbor. And they had this library that held like over 200,000 books. But those books would have been scrolls, and they would have all been copied and written by hand. And just like Smyrna, they had a temple that was dedicated to the Caesar. In fact, they actually had 3 temples dedicated to emperor worship. But along with that, they also had this temple dedicated to Aesculapius, which is the god of healing. And all of their priests, well, they were considered to be like doctors. So here you have this university town with a medical school, and their symbol was actually the snake on a pole, and it's the same exact symbol that they use for the American Medical Association today. And we know that that symbol originally had its roots like with Moses and the snake on a pole with the children of Israel. That's in the book of Numbers. But here, people would come from all over the world, and they would come to sleep on the temple floor. And when you slept on the temple floor at night, what they would do is they would release all these non-poisonous snakes. And if one of them touched you, it was considered to be like the touch of God, because their god, Aesculapius, he often took the form of a snake. And they would call this guy the Savior Serpent. All right. So now Jesus, he addresses the pastor of Pergamos. And to these people, Jesus, he's identifying himself as a warrior, because that's how he's going to come to them. He's the one who has a sharp 2-edged sword. And that's that long sword that's mentioned in chapter 1 for doing battle. And again, Jesus, he tells these guys, he says, he knows their works. And then he also tells them that he knows where they dwell. And he says that they dwell where Satan's throne is. And now it kind of seems like it'd be kind of a terrible thing to say about your city. And, you might think something like, shouldn't Satan's throne be somewhere like Rome or maybe Babylon, or maybe it should be in San Francisco or Washington, D.C.? But clearly here, Satan's throne is not in hell like a lot of people think it is. But at this time, it's in Pergamos. And you will find on the top of that hill in Pergamos that they had a temple to Zeus. And it could be seen from 50 miles away. And it was built, and it looked like a throne. And it was also one of the 7 great wonders of the ancient world. And then now Jesus, he comes and he says something good about this church in Pergamos, where he says that during the days of Antipas, who Jesus calls his faithful martyr, and that word martyr there is the same word used for witness. It's the same word that was used in chapter 1 toward Jesus himself, where it called him a witness. It's the same word, martyr.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.